Chapter 3 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimké. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Hercules in the Nemean Forest. One December evening nearly 60 years ago, there might have been seen in New York a young Bostonian of the most striking appearance. A hero he seemed in height, though hardly a hero in proportions. Thin and long drawn out he was, a straight line set on straight lines, and endowed with marvellous length of limbs and prodigious powers of locomotion. The appositeness of that bit of biblical humour of the Lord's taking no pleasure in the legs of a man would have quickly occurred to the mind of an irreverent wit, for certainly the ambulatory appendages of the young gentleman were deficient in grace and comeliness. Yet laugh would neither your irreverent wit nor would we, for there was withal so much of eagerness, energy, enthusiasm, expressed and flung off, as it were, by the flying figure, that both he and we must have instantly forgotten the subject of its proportions and the higher one of its personality. And had we tracked him to his rooms, our curiosity would have been further piqued by these additional points: an ample and shapely mouth, a gleaming with large white teeth, dark masterful eyes, a nose long and regular, a brow broad and lofty, and a head of uncommon size, covered with masses of thick brown hair. We would have been struck in the tout ensemble of figure and face by that sort of immature strength and splendour which distinguishes a growing mastiff. And well we might, for he, the original, belonged to that superb breed of human watchdogs who appear at intervals in the history of mankind to stand ward and watch over their rights. It was Charles Sumner at the age of 26, and on the eve of his first visit to Europe in 1837. This visit to Europe was in Sumner's life no ordinary event, but was meant to add the finishing touches to his great preparation. When rallied, as young men are wont to be, on the subject of matrimony, he used to reply, "I married to Europa." And it was so indeed, for until he had satisfied the desire of his soul by going abroad for study, he had no superfluous devotion to lay at the feet of any other passion or attraction. Perhaps a few extracts from his letters will serve to exhibit the ardor and strength of his desire in this regard, and also the uses to which he meant to convert his visit abroad. Writing to a friend, acknowledging the receipt of a foreign letter sent to him for perusal by that friend, Sumner expresses himself in this wise: "I'm always delighted, it amounts almost to a monomania in me, to see any such missive from abroad, or to hear personal, literary, or legal news about the distinguished men of whom I read." 2 years later, in the summer of 1837, thus to Dr. Lieber: "The thought of Europe fills me with the most tumultuous emotions. There, it seems, my heart is garnered up. I feel, when I commune with myself about it, as when dwelling on the countenance and voice of a lovely girl. I'm in love with Europa." And a few months later to the same: "I shall remember you at every step of my journey, and in your dear fatherland shall especially call you to my mind. Oh, that I spoke your tongue! I shall write you in German from Germany. There, on the spot, with the mighty genius of your language hovering over me, I will master it. To that my nights and days must be devoted. The spirits of Goethe and Richter and Luther will cry in my ears, trumpet-tongued. I would give Golconda or Potosi or all Mexico if I had them for your German tongue." And later still this: "Tomorrow I embark for Havre, and I assure you it is with a palpitating heart that I think of it. Hope and joyous anticipation send a thrill through me, but a deep anxiety and sense of the importance of this step check the thrill of pleasure. I need say nothing to you, I believe, in justification of my course, as you enter with lively feelings into my ambition and desires. Believe me that I know my position and duties, and though I trust Europe may improve and return me to my own dear country with a more thorough education and a higher standard of ambition in life, yet it cannot destroy any simplicity of character which I possess, or divert me from the duties of the world." To Professor Greenleaf, from the Astor House, on the eve of his departure, he writes: "It is no slight affair to break away from the business which is to give me my daily bread, and pass across the sea to untried countries, usages, and languages, and I feel now pressing with a mountain's weight the responsibility of my step. But I go abroad with the purest determination to devote myself to self-improvement from the various sources of study, observation, and society, and to return an American. And to Hillard the next day. We have left the wharf, and with a steamer by our side. A smacking breeze has sprung up, and we shall part this company soon, and then for the Atlantic. Farewell, then, my friends, my pursuits, my home, my country. Each bellying wave on its rough crest carries me away. The rocking vessel impedes my pen, and now, as my head begins slightly to reel, my imagination entertains the glorious prospects before me, the time-honored rites and edifices of the old world, her world-renowned men, her institutions handed down from distant generations, and her various languages replete with learning and genius. These may I enjoy in the spirit that becomes a Christian and an American. When the plan of this visit was forming in his mind, he took counsel with his friends, Judge Story, Professor Greenleaf, and President Quincy, who were not at all well affected to it. The two first feared that it would wean him from his profession, the latter that Europe would spoil him, send him back with a mustache and a walking stick. Certainly the step was an extraordinary one for a young lawyer to take, and would require extraordinary reasons to justify it, of all of which Sumner was, as the time for his departure drew nigh, gravely and even painfully conscious. But we will let him present his own case to the reader, its pros and cons, just as he entered them in his journal on Christmas Day, while still at sea. He has been reviewing his last day on shore, how he dined with his friend and called on another, how he busied himself with parting words to other friends far into the watches of that last night, and continues thus. And a sad time it was, full of anxious thoughts and doubts, with mingled gleams of glorious anticipations. I thought much of the position which I had abandoned for the present, the competent income which I forsook, the foaming tide whose buoyant waters were bearing me so well, which I refused to take even at its ebb. These I thought of, and then the advice and warnings of many whose opinions I respect, the dear friends I was to leave behind, all came rushing before me, and affection for them was a new element in the cup of my anxieties. But on the other hand, the dreams of my boyhood came before me, the long-pondered visions first suggested by my early studies, and receiving new additions with every step of my progress. My desire, which has long been above all other desires, to visit Europe, and my long-cherished anticipations of the most intellectual pleasure and the most permanent profit. Europe and its reverend history, its ancient races, its governments handed down from all time, its sites memorable in story, above all, it presents existing institutions, laws, and society, and its men of note and mind followed in the train, and the thought of all these reassured my spirit. In going abroad at my present age, and situated as I am, I feel that I take a bold, almost a rash step. One should not easily believe that he can throw off his clients and then whistle them back as a huntsman does his pack. But I go for purposes of education, and to gratify longings which prey upon my mind and time. Certainly I never could be content to mingle in the business of my profession with that devotion which is necessary to the highest success until I visited Europe. The course which my studies have taken has also made it highly desirable that I should have the advantage derived from a knowledge of the European languages, particularly French and German, and also a moderate acquaintance with the laws and institutions of the Old World, more at least than I can easily gain at home. In my pursuits lately I felt the want of this knowledge, both of the languages, particularly German, and of the continental jurisprudence. I believe, then, that by leaving my profession now, I make a present sacrifice for a future gain, that I shall return with increased abilities for doing good and acting well my part in life. The fears of Sumner's friends were vain. Ah, how little did they, the noblest of them, comprehend him or his future! How little, in truth, did he comprehend himself and the destiny which futurity had in keeping for him! How impossible for him or them to foresee that this visit abroad was but to complete his apprenticeship, to finish the great preparation! To revert to the Greek fable, it was like Hercules going into the Nemean forest to cut himself a club. The Nemean forest, into which Sumner was now plunging, was Europe, with its whole societies, laws, languages, literatures, races, and the club with which he was to arm himself for the Herculean labors of his ripened faculties was enlarged human sympathies, a wider, deeper knowledge of man. It was an audacious boast of Guizot that France is the center, the focus of European civilization, the leader of European progress. There is not a single great idea, not a single great principle of civilization, says this celebrated historian, which, in order to become universally spread, has not first passed through France. If this is so, and as a general proposition I see no reason to question its soundness, then Paris, which is the center and focus of French life, is the place of all others to enter upon the study of European life. And to Paris the young American scholar accordingly betook him at once for the accomplishment of his purpose. But of what value to him was a residence in the French metropolis without the use of the French language? It was the clue to the human labyrinth into which he had plunged, and he had it not. To know French with the eye was one thing, to know it with the ear and the tongue quite another thing. He found himself, in respect of the latter knowledge, as helpless as a child just beginning to talk. But with characteristic thoroughness and self-denial he attacked this difficulty. He studied French by day, and he studied it by night. He studied it first under one teacher and then under two teachers. He studied it at his meals, taking good care so to surround himself that he had need to make constant attempts to get his tongue acquainted with the language, in order to express his wants and to accustom his ears to it, in order to place himself in communication with the minds about him. Among other means used by him to this end were the theatres which he frequented. Here, with copies of the plays before him, he followed the players with the eye and ear, learning in this way to blend form with sound, to listen with the sense of sight, and to see with the sense of hearing. The lectures of the famous schools he made to serve his purpose in this regard also. Of course he blundered like any beginner, and his errors were amusing enough at times. Here is a case in point. He has called on Felix, the distinguished editor of the Revue Étrangère, and a French admirer of Judge Story. On being shown into the room of the learned pundit, writes Sumner, I summoned all my French and asked, Est-ce Monsieur Felix que j'ai l'honneur de voir? To which he replied in the affirmative. I then said, Je m'appelle Charles Sumner. His reply convinced me that I had pronounced my French so badly that he did not understand me, for he inquired if I had seen Mr. Sumner lately. Then ensued a series of contretemps. He did not speak a word of English, and my French was no more fit for use than a rusty gun-barrel, or than the law of a retired barrister. Then came to our assistance his sister. She knew English so as to speak it pretty well, though rather painfully. With her as interpreter he made himself known to his host, whose ignorance of English and Sumner's of French made intercourse for the time being between them better honored in the breach than in the observance. A week later, however, he dined with Monsieur Felix, when, being appealed to with regard to the Constitution of the United States, etc., the young American threw himself upon his little knowledge of French to learn that his labor was not in vain. I felt conscious of continual blunders, he records afterward in his journal, but I also felt that I was understood, so that I was making language serve its principal purpose, namely to convey thought. I often spoke little better than gibberish, but still I spoke on. This was a triumph to me, and I began to feel for the first time that I was gradually acquiring the language. French was an indispensable instrument in the prosecution of his studies, and to its acquisition he bent his first 2 months in Paris and all the concentration of his energies. Never was his industry greater, and never perhaps was it more fruitful. The first time that he attended a lecture at the École de Droit, he was unable to understand a single sentence, but in less than 3 weeks afterwards, so successfully had they been employed, that he was able to follow the lecturer through the largest portion of his lecture. In 6 weeks he was able to converse in the language, and at the expiration of 3 months was competent to assume the role of interpreter in judicial proceedings in which a compatriot figured. During this period, while struggling with the French tongue, he was making daily accretions to the stores of his knowledge in the famous schools of Paris, where he listened to nearly 200 lectures, not alone on his favorite subjects of jurisprudence, history, and belles lettres, but also on science and philosophy. Paris, with her 1,001 attractions and opportunities to the general student, lay spread out at the feet of the young scholar. Her ancient buildings and landmarks, her picture galleries and monuments, her public hospitals and charities, her courts, churches, and theatres, her celebrated men, legislators, littérateurs, and savants, her brilliant society and salon, in short, all her large cosmopolitan life and human point of view, no one of which escaped the eager, indefatigable, all-devouring mind of Sumner. To Hillard, just 3 months after his departure from New York, he wrote, "I shall stay in Paris till the middle of April. I find 10 times as much here to interest me as I anticipated. The lectures, the courts, the arts, each would consume a year, to say nothing of the language which I am trying after very hard. To Dr. Lieber, all that you have promised for me in Europe has been more than realized. I have seen new lives, and the life of life seems to have burst upon me. Cicero could hardly have walked with a more bounding and yet placid joy through the avenues of his Elysium, and conversed with Scipio and Lelius, than I, a distant American of a country which has no prescription, no history, and no association, walk daily in the places which now surround me." May 21, he wrote, Judge Story, "Still in Paris and still longing to stay here. I've promised many persons that I will return, and I must return. I find myself on a track which no American, perhaps no Englishman, has ever followed. I wish to master the judicial institutions of this great country, and for this purpose to talk with the most eminent judges, lawyers, and professors, and to get their views upon the actual operation of things. How I shall use the materials I may collect remains to be seen, whether in a work presenting a comparative view of the judicial institutions of France, England, and America, particularly with a view to the theory of proofs and the initiation of causes, I cannot tell, but certainly there is a vast amount of valuable information which I may harvest in future years. In collecting this information, I see before me the clear way of doing good and gratifying a just desire for reputation." These opportunities and experiences, highly prized as they were by him, Sumner, could not blind him to the merits of America. "I've never felt myself so much an American," he wrote Judge Story, "have never loved my country so ardently as since I left it. I live in the midst of manners, institutions, and a form of government wholly unlike those under which I was born, and I now feel in stronger relief than ever the superior character impressed upon our country in all the essentials of happiness, honor, and prosperity. I would not exchange my country for all that I can see and enjoy here, and dull must his soul be, unworthy of America, who would barter the priceless intelligence which pervades his whole country, the universality of happiness and the absence of beggary, the reasonable equality of all men as regards each other in the law, and the general vigor which fills every member of society, besides the high moral tone, and take the state of things which I find here, where wealth flaunts by the side of the most squalid poverty, where your eyes are constantly annoyed by the most disgusting want and wretchedness, and where American purity is inconceivable." But if months in the French metropolis could not blind the young American to the merits of his country, neither could they hide from him her one great sin. The national skeleton haunted Sumner in the gay and brilliant center of European life. Slavery was an evil whose astral form had an uncomfortable way of appearing to Americans in all parts of the world. Wherever they traveled in the Old World, there, sooner or later, they were sure to encounter the ghost of the Republic's murdered Banquo. The noise of the fierce struggle in Congress over the right of petition reached across the waters, and the tyranny of the slave power aroused his indignation, as witness this word to Hillard: "Why did the Northern members of Congress bear the infamous bullying of the South? Dissolve the Union, I say." Willy-nilly, he was forced to reflect upon the subject of slavery at home. He was forced to listen to the reflections of others on the same subject also. He called on Sismondi, the historian of the Italian republics, and lo, Sismondi proceeds to speak at length and with ardor on that theme. Sismondi is a thoroughgoing abolitionist, and is astonished that America does not profit from the experience of other nations and eradicate slavery, as has been done in the civilized parts of Europe. In Paris, Sumner meets a South Carolina slave holder who is nevertheless opposed to the peculiar institution, and believes it can be and ought to be abolished. Besides these lessons in liberty, the young scholar received his first practical ones in human equality and fraternity. It was while attending the lectures of de Gerondeau and Rossi in the École de Droit that Sumner noticed among the audience 2 or 3 colored pupils, dressed quite à la mode, and having the easy, jaunty air of young men of fashion, who were well received by their fellow students. They were standing in the midst of a knot of young men, and their color seemed to be no objection to them. Whereupon Sumner makes this observation and deduction in his journal: "I was glad to see this, though with American impressions it seemed very strange. It must be, then, that the distance between free blacks and the whites among us is derived from education, and does not exist in the nature of things." After a residence of 5 months, Sumner left Paris and passed over to London, in anticipation of which he wrote Jed's story in May. I leave Paris with the liveliest regret, and feeling very much as when I left Boston, with 1,000 things undone, unlearned, and unstudied, which I wished to do, to learn, and to study. I start for England, and how my soul leaps at the thought, land of my studies, my thoughts, and my dreams. There indeed shall I pluck the life of life. Much have I enjoyed and learned at Paris, but my course has been constantly impeded by the necessity of unremitted study. The language was foreign, as were the manners, institutions, and laws. I've been a learner daily. I could understand nothing without study. But in England everything will be otherwise. The page of English history is a familiar story. The English law has been my devoted pursuit for years, English politics my pastime, and the English language is my own. I shall there at once leap to the full enjoyment of all the mighty interests which England affords, and I shall be able to mingle at once with its society, catch its tone, and join in its conversation, attend the course, and follow all their proceedings as those at home. Here, then, is a pleasure which is great almost beyond comparison, greater to my mind than anything else on earth, except the consciousness of doing good, greater than wealth and all the enjoyments which it brings. Delightful as was England in anticipation, England in reality far exceeded it. It was impossible for Sumner to have foreseen what it was in store for him. Never before had an American been so cordially received, been the recipient of attention so universal and distinguished from the upper classes of British society, as made the young scholar's sojourn in the United Kingdom one round of opportunities and successes. Not even Everett, Tinkner, Adams, Longfellow, Motley, and Winthrop, in the maturity of their fame, were so lionized as was their young and unknown compatriot. He averaged at least 5 invitations a day, was admitted as a foreign visitor into 4 of the London clubs, was welcomed with open arms by bench and bar, by the foremost men of letters, science, and philosophy, by the leading clergymen and statesmen of the land. So extraordinary was the demand for his company at dinners that in some instances it could only be obtained by engagements 10 days in advance. Indeed, his popularity in society became justly so great and so general, someone has remarked, that his friends began to devise what circle there was to show him which he had not yet seen, what great house that he had not yet visited. It was even so, for Sumner was an honored guest at most of the country seats of England and Scotland. He was welcomed by Whigs and Tories with equal cordiality into their households. He travelled the circus as the companion of judges like Denman, Vaughan, Park, and Alderson, and of leaders of the bar like Follett, Talfourd, Wilde, and Rolfe. He met on familiar footing such luminaries of the world of letters as were Hallam, Grote, Macaulay, and Landor. Carlyle, whom he visited and heard lecture, seemed to him like an inspired boy, so galvanic were the thoughts which came from him, couched in a style grotesque and intense in the highest degree. On remarking to Lord Jeffrey that Carlyle had very much changed his style since he wrote his article on Burns, the great critic replied, "Not at all. I will tell you why that is different from his other articles. I altered it." With Wordsworth, whom he also visited, he was quite charmed, so simple, graceful, and sincere were his manners and conversation. I felt that I was conversing with a superior being. Sumner wrote Hillard, yet I was entirely at my ease. The poet spoke warmly on 2 subjects, slavery and copyright. Very different were our young traveller's impressions of another great man whom he also visited, viz., Lord Brougham. "I am almost sorry that I have seen Lord B.," he wrote Hillard, "for I can no longer paint him to my mind's eye as the pure and enlightened orator of Christianity, civilization, and humanity. I see him now, as before, with powers such as belong to angels. Why could I not have found him with an angel's purity, gentleness, and simplicity? I must always admire his productions as models of art, but I fear that I shall distrust his sincerity and the purity of his motives." Sumner's failing faith in this unlovely and extraordinary man was not checked by the discovery, made at his own table, that he was addicted to the vulgar vice of swearing to an unparalleled extent. "I've dined in company nearly every day since I've been in England," Sumner remarked in one of his letters, "and I do not remember to have met a person who swore half so much as Lord Brougham, and all this in conversation with an aged clergyman." Sidney Smith's conversation Sumner found infinitely pleasant and instructive too, while that of Macaulay he set down as rapid, brilliant, and powerful, by far the best of any in the company, though Mr. Senior was there, and several others of no mean powers. But Geoffrey, who pleases by the alternate exercise of every talent, at one moment by a rapid argument, then by a beautiful illustration, next by a phrase which draws a whole thought into its powerful focus, while a constant grace of language and amenity of manners, with proper contributions from humour and wit, heighten these charms, he pits against the world of conversationalists. Sumner notes in one of his letters a somewhat curious and questionable custom which obtains in England in connection with card-playing. "I found it universal in England," he wrote Hilliard, "to play for money. Sober persons make the sum sixpence on each point, a term which I do not understand, though I have gained several points, I've been told. I played one evening with Lord Fitzwilliam as my partner, and we won between us about £1, which was duly paid and received. Another evening he plays with the young Scarborough and De Manley, and a clergyman. When he is again successful, and the clergyman pays him 5 shillings. All this was very distasteful to his Puritan prejudice against cards at their best estate, but since he was in Rome he fell into accord, socially speaking, with what was lawful for Romans to do, asking no questions for conscience' sake. Quite unlike the usage in this country, man and wife, when playing cards in England, are always partners, because, as Lord Fitzwilliam observed within Sumner's hearing, they would gain nothing. It would do a man no good to win from his wife. And Lord Fitzwilliam, the young Puritan tolerantly remarked, is a person of the greatest purity of character and religious feeling. The young scholar's life was full to overflowing with the most interesting experiences. Existence was a gold goblet, brimming with the juices of 1,000 vineyards and delights. Wherever he turned, his eyes fell upon wide illuminated pages of human life, and wherever he listened, voices of a great and glorious past ravished his intellect. His joy was supreme, complete, as he stood before those architectural mountains of the north and of the south of England, Durham and Salisbury cathedrals. "My happiest moments in this island," he wrote Hilliard from Fairfield Lodge near York, "have been when I saw Salisbury and Durham cathedrals. Much happiness have I enjoyed in the various distinguished and interesting society in which I have been permitted to mingle, but greater than all this was that which I felt when I first gazed upon the glorious buildings I have mentioned. Then it was that I was in communion with no single mind, bright and gifted though it be, but with whole generations. Those voiceless walls seemed to speak, and the olden time with its sceptred pall passed before me. Oh, it was with a thrill of pleasure that I looked from the spire of Salisbury and wandered among the heavy arches of Durham, which I can never forget." He spent a part of the Christmas holidays of 1838 at Milton Park with Lord Fitzwilliam, and there participated in the English sport of fox hunting for the first time. He sent to Hilliard a graphic description of one of these performances and of his own hairbreadth escapes. "The morning after my arrival," he writes, "I mounted at 9:30 a beautiful hunter, and rode with Lord Milton about 6 miles to the place of meeting. There were the hounds and huntsmen and whippers in, and about 80 horsemen, the noblemen and gentry and clergy of the neighbourhood, all beautifully mounted, and the greater part in red coats, leather breeches, and white top boots. The hounds were sent into the cover, and it was a grand sight to see so many handsome dogs, all of a size, and all washed before coming out, rushing into the underwood to start the fox. We were unfortunate in not getting a scent immediately, and rode from cover to cover, but soon the cry was raised, 'Tally-ho!' The dogs barked, the horsemen rallied, the hounds centered their way through the cover on the trail of the fox, and then started in full run. I had originally intended only to ride to cover to see them throw off, and then make my way home, believing myself unequal to the probable run, but the chase commenced, and I was in the midst of it, and being excellently mounted, nearly at the head of it. Never did I see such a scamper, and never did it enter into my head that horses could be pushed to such speed in such places. We dashed through and over bushes, leaping broad ditches, splashing in brooks and mud, and passing over fences as so many imaginary lines. My first fence I shall not readily forget. I was near Lord Milton, who was mounted on a thoroughbred horse. He cleared a fence before him. My horse pawed the ground and neighed. I gave him the rein, and he cleared the fence. As I was up in the air for one moment, how was I startled to look down and see that there was not only a fence, but a ditch. He cleared the ditch too. I've said it was my first experiment. I lost my balance, was thrown to the very ears of the horse, but in some way or other contrived to work myself back to the saddle without touching the ground. Vide some of the hunting pictures of leaps, etc. How I got back I cannot tell, but I did regain my seat, and my horse was at a run in a moment. All this, you will understand, passed in less time by far than it will take to read this account. One moment we were in a scamper through a ploughed field, another over a beautiful pasture, and another winding through the devious paths of a wood. I think I may say that in no single day of my life did I ever take so much exercise. I said that I mounted at 9:30 o'clock. It wanted 20 minutes of 5 when I finally dismounted, not having been out of the saddle more than 30 seconds during all this time, and then only to change my horse, taking a fresh one from a groom who was in attendance. During much of the time we were on a full run. Sumner's experience anent the English custom of card-playing, the reader will recall, ran somewhat against the grain of his New England conscience. The English sport of fox-hunting, though much enjoyed at the time, exerted upon reflection a sobering influence upon him also. I was excited and interested by it. I confess, he wrote Hilliard, I should like to enjoy it more, and have pressing invitations to continue my visit or renew it, and at some future period. But I have moralized much upon it, have been made melancholy by seeing the time and money that are lavished on this sport, and observing the utter unproductiveness of the lives of those who are most earnestly engaged in it. Like my lord's family, whose mornings are devoted to it, and whose evenings are rounded by a sleep. Europe could not spoil him, or silence within him the still small voice of duty and aspiration, President Quincy's apprehensions to the contrary notwithstanding. England, like France, failed to make inroads upon the simplicity of his character and manners, upon his loyalty to country and old friends. He remained at the end of this first visit to England as he was in the beginning of it, the same natural, genial, unaffected lover of learning and learned men and women. Not for an instant, amid all the seductions of the most brilliant society of the Old World, was his ardent affection for America lessened. Not that he was blind to the faults of America. Indeed, from his perch across the Atlantic they appeared with painful distinctness to him. Her politics seemed petty and provincial by the side of the world-wide questions which occupied the thought and time of Europeans. He frankly owned that in England what is called society is better educated, more refined, and more civilized than what is called society in our country. Still, he was none the less American for seeing these points which put America at a disadvantage when compared with Europe. The true pride of his country he perceived, as he had not before this visit abroad perceived it, lay, as Charles Buller put it, withal below the silk-stocking classes. The American silk-stocking classes were undeniably not on a level with the silk-stocking classes of the mother country, but that it was quite otherwise with the middle and poorer classes Sumner was not slow to discern. The true pride of America, he wrote in one of his letters, is in her middle and poorer classes, in their general health and happiness and freedom from poverty, in their facilities for being educated, and in the opportunities open to them of rising in the scale. As Sumner was to come into collision with these silk-stocking classes of America, it was of no small moment to him that he should get this comparative view of them at this time, see them with the unprejudiced eye of an intelligent and liberal-minded outsider. For he was at the same time and unconsciously emancipating his mind from the spell which such classes throw over individuals, the strongest and most upright. Destiny had thus early discharged for the young scholar this power, forearmed him against its enslaving influence. He was, during this visit to England, full of the most kindly offices to friends and compatriots. Now these friendly offices were directed to calling the attention of English men of letters to Prescott's History of Ferdinand and Isabella, then just published, and to securing for it appreciative and scholarly review from competent hands. Now they were enlisted in behalf of Judge Story, getting at his instant copies of important legal manuscripts, or looking after the interests of the judge's fast multiplying works upon the law. Or maybe they were addressed toward enhancing the sale, or obtaining a publisher for some one of the many volumes from the prolific pen of Dr. Lieber. In fine, they and others found an infinite capacity of friendly service in the young scholar. As he himself expressed it in a letter, "It is not simply the seeing sights and enjoying society that occupy me, but I happen everywhere upon people who wish some sort of thing, some information about something which I am supposed to know, who wish introductions in America or England or the like, and forsooth I must be submissive and respond to their wishes. I assure you my tour has been full of pleasure and instruction, but it has not been less full of work. Some men seem born to serve their fellows, and Charles Sumner was undoubtedly of this class." He performed for the United States a noteworthy service at this period, the controversy growing out of the conflict of claims in relation to the boundary line between the possessions of Great Britain and those of the American Republic, and known as the Northeastern Boundary, or Maine disturbances, took on while Sumner was in England a rather bellicose tone. The state of Maine, a part of whose territory was in dispute, was particularly belligerent, having erected and garrisoned a series of forts along her frontier line to defend her title. Her chief executive was, besides, a rash and hot-headed counselor, with whose intemperate message on the question Sumner was not a little disgusted when he read the undignified, illiterate, and blustering document of this American official. He confessed to Hillard, "I felt ashamed of my country." But if Sumner disapproved of the Maine method of settling a grave international dispute, he by no means disapproved of the claims of his country touching the northeastern boundary line. Indeed, when in Paris the second time he prepared, at the request of the United States minister to France, General Louis Cass, a clear and elaborate statement of the American case, which was published in Galignani's Messenger, and produced a highly favorable impression upon the thinking people of America and in England, Professor Greenleaf was delighted with it, thought that the document entitled the author to a secretaryship of legation. Edward Everett was hardly less appreciative of the public service rendered by the young scholar, while Robert Ingram, Englishman though he was, viewed the argument as conclusive against the position of Great Britain in the controversy. The possibility of war between England and the United States excited in Sumner the most painful emotions, and strengthened undoubtedly his growing opposition to the arbitrament of the sword in the settlement of differences between nations. Writing Lord Morpeth concerning his own apprehensions in this regard, and of his reliance upon the deep love to England of the educated classes of the Union to avert an actual outbreak between the two countries, Sumner said, "Still it is a dreadful thing to entertain the idea of the possibility of such a war, the most fratricidal ever waged. My own heart is so bound up in England, while as to a first love I turn to my own country, that I cannot forbear writing you as I do. You can do much in your high place and with your great influence to avert such a calamity, and I shall always look to you as one of the peace preservers. For myself, I hold all wars as unjust and unchristian. I should consider either country as committing a great crime that entered into a war for the sordid purpose of securing a few more acres of land." The human question was plainly transcending in the mind of Sumner all narrower questions of race and country, thanks to the human love which welcomed him everywhere in England as a brother. After a sojourn of 9 months in England, Sumner recrossed the Channel to France and passed 4 interesting weeks in Paris, where he found Lord Brougham and other friends, French, English, and American, with whom he renewed old acquaintances. Paris was as gay and fascinating as ever. He rejoiced afresh in the beautiful city, not alone for its splendid sights and scenes, but for its people's palaces, for its museums stored in the halls of kings, which are gazed on by the humble, the lowly, and the poor. "I again entered the Louvre with a throb," he wrote Hillard, "and rejoiced as I ascended its magnificent stairway to think that it was no fee possession set apart to please the eyes of royalty." Nowhere, in sooth, whether in England or France, was the young American unmindful of the situation or of the rights of the people. Their wretchedness depressed, their advancement elevated his spirits. In the month of May he set sail from Marseilles for sunny Italy, land of his studies and of his dreams. The happiness of our tourist may be said to have touched its high-water mark under skies which had once smiled on Virgil and Horace, on Cicero, Caesar, and Tacitus. Here, amid historic sites and ruins, he revived the glory of Augustus, the arms and the letters of Rome. From Naples he wrote, "How can I describe to you, my dear Hillard, the richness of pleasure that I have enjoyed? Here is that beautiful bay, with its waters reflecting the blue heavens, and its delicious shores studded with historical associations. What day's enjoyment has been the greatest I cannot tell, whether when I walked amidst the streets of Pompeii and trod the beautiful mosaics of its houses, or when I visited Baiae and Misenum and looked off upon Capri and Procida, or when I mounted the rough lava sides of Vesuvius and saw the furnace-like fires which glowed in its yawning cracks and seams. I think I do not say too much when I let you know that, with all my ardent expectations, I never adequately conceived the thrilling influences shed by these ancient classical sights and things. You walk the well-adjusted pavement of Pompeii, and distinctly discern the traces of wheels worn into its hard stone, and in the houses you see mosaics and frescoes and choice marbles that make you start. But reach the Forum, and there you are, in the midst of columns and arches and temples that would seem wonderful to us if found in a grand city, but are doubly so when disentombed in a humble town. What must Rome have been, whose porches and columns and arches excited the wonder of the ancient world, if this little place, of whose disastrous fate only we have heard an account, contained such treasures? I do not believe there is a single town of the size of the ancient Pompeii in modern Europe where you will find so much public or private magnificence, where you will enter so many private dwellings enriched by the chisel and the pencil, or stand in a public square like her Forum. Capo Micino is on the opposite side of the bay. One day's excursion carried me over the scene of the Cumaean Sibyl. I would fain have sent you home a mistletoe from the thick wood round the ancient lake Avernus, even down the dark cave which once opened to the regions of night by the Lucrine bank, whence came the oysters on which Horace and Juvenal fed, over the remains of Baiae, where are still to be seen those substructions and piles by which, as our old poet said, their rich owners sought to abridge the rightful domain of the sea. And on the top of Capo Messino, in the shade of the vine, with fresh breezes coming from Hesperus in the west, and in the ancient gardens of Lucullus, I sat down to such a breakfast as the poor peasants of this fertile land could supply. But amid such enchanting scenery and associations, the pure joy of the young scholar is marred by the presence of human wretchedness. The Neapolitan beggar is ubiquitous and irrepressible. Beggary is here incarnate, he exclaims. You cannot leave the house without being surrounded by half a dozen squalid wretches. They travel with you and go into the country with you, wherever you make a sortie from the town, as if joined to your person, and on the quays they stretch themselves at full length, while a hot sun is letting fall its perpendicular rays. Perhaps these Lazzaroni had for Sumner their lesson no less than the vestiges of an imposing past. Were they not equally, with broken columns and buried cities, witnesses to the fall of the mistress of the world? How had Rome risen, how fallen? What was the unguessed riddle of conduct which turned loose upon her mighty power and her mighty children the all-devouring sphinx of the moral law? Did not these beggarly Neapolitans show that the soul that sinneth, whether social or individual, surely dies? Ah, sin was the destroyer. Sin brought the men and their monuments together into the dust. And these repulsive creatures, what were they but the gibbering ghosts of a once tremendous race, wandering wretched amid scenes of past greatness and glory, for the living a dreadful monition to the strength of human folly and iniquity? Yes, to the young American. They too held a lesson of the gravest moment to his far-away country, where, meanwhile, was fiercely enacting the supreme tragedy of freedom, of national folly and iniquity. But the scholar proves too strong for the moralist amid the eloquent remains of the eternal city. Voices are ringing in his ears, but they are voices of sages and statesmen, poets, orators, and historians. To his scholar's soul the present has become the past the present. Rome reigns again on her 7 hills. Horace sings, Cicero fulmines, Augustus mounts the steps to the Capitol. The dreams of his boyhood and manhood have at last come to pass. He is in a state of constant delight, for he has passed through dirty Capua, shorn of all its soft temptations, with difficulty found a breakfast of chocolate and bread where Hannibal's victorious troops, wasted with luxury and excess, enjoyed the perfume of the orange and lemon trees that lined the way in the territories of Naples. At midnight awoke the last gendarme of his Neapolitan Majesty, who swung open the heavy gates through which we entered the territories of the Supreme Pontiff, rode all night, crossed for 28 miles the Pontine marshes, and at length from the heights of Alba, near the tomb of the Curiatii, descried the dome of St. Peter's and Rome. He opens and reads a letter from home on the Capitoline Hill, with those steps in view over which the friars walk while Gibbon contemplated the wonderful equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius before me, while thickening about in every direction were the associations of old Rome. Ah, what joys open to him in Rome! Art in these noble galleries, and antiquity in these noble ruins, he wrote, afford constant interest. To these and to Italian literature I have given myself here. Painting I have studied in the works of the masters before me, and in the various books in which their lives and merits are commemorated, and I have not contented myself by simply seeing and looking upon the ancient remains that have been preserved to us. No, he reads Horace in the very Tiburtine grove, celebrated by the exquisite genius of the poet, and feels on the spot the felicity of the verses. For 4 July days, Sumner and George W. Greene, the then scholarly American consul at Rome, were the guests of Franciscan friars at the convent of Paluzuola, on the ancient site of Alba Longa, of which scarcely the least trace is now to be found. The former wrote descriptively to Hallard, and overlooks the beautiful Alban Lake. No carriage can approach within 2 miles on either side, and it is surrounded by precipices and almost impenetrable forests. I do not remember ever to have seen a more lovely and romantic situation. Here we read, the poets chat with the fathers, ramble in the woods, and bathe in the clear waters. The scene is so like a picture that I sometimes look to see Diana in full chase with her nymphs about her. To Longfellow he wrote, touching the sort of reception which awaited Felton, who was then expecting to visit Europe soon. The cellar should send up its richest treasures. Cellar, did I say? The grottos shall afford their most icy wines, and with him we will try to find amidst these thick woods and precipitous descents some remains of that noble city which was so long a match for Rome. In our garden we will show him a tomb with the fasces still boldly visible, where reposes the dust of a consul of the Republic. While to Professor Greenleaf he wrote from his monastic retreat, in the background is the high mountain which was once dedicated to Latial Jove, to whom Cicero makes his eloquent appeal in the oration for Milo, and on one side, clearly discernible from my windows, is Tusculum, the favorite residence of the great Roman orator. That indeed was a change for Sumner from England to Italy. In the one country he existed mainly in the present, touching wherever he turned the living thought of living minds and a living society and civilization. From every direction life pressed around him, strong and restless as the sea which girts the island home of the English people. There he spoke a living language, studied living laws and institutions, scanned the pages of a living literature, pondered living problems in conduct. But in Italy he dwelt mainly in the past, touched elbows with the dead, lived and moved in the fair and stately world of books. His industry was astonishing, his achievement prodigious. He mastered the Italian language and explored the enchanted land of Italian literature from Dante to Alfieri. His days are devoted to these literary excursions. They begin about 6:30 in the morning, and continue with but a slight intermission for breakfast at 10, until between 5 and 6 in the afternoon, when he dresses for dinner, and which consists usually of fruits, salads, and wine, spread up under a mulberry tree in a garden. By this time his friend Greene calls for him, and together they sally forth on a quest of discovery within or without the walls of Rome. Many an hour the friends, seated upon a broken column or a rich capitol in the Via Sacra or the Colosseum, have called to mind what has passed before them, weaving out the web of the story they might tell. Then Sumner returns to his readings, and what readings they are, to be sure! Dante, Tasso, and Ariosto, of Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Machiavelli, and Alfieri, Guicciardini, Niccolini, Romanosi, Lezzoni. In fine, these readings extend through a long list of those works of genius which comprise the literature of modern Italy. Indeed, he is studied to such purpose that after a residence of 4 months in Italy he is able to write a friend that there is no Italian which I cannot understand without a dictionary. There is hardly a classic in the language of which I have not read the whole or considerable portions. I understand everything that is said in a coach, can talk on any subject with such facility, notwithstanding mistakes, that even in French-speaking Milan all the valets and waiters address him as if to the manner born. During Sumner's residence in Italy he met and greatly admired 3 American sculptors then doing capital work there, viz. Greenough, Powers, and Crawford, between the latter of whom and the young scholar there sprang up a lifelong friendship. Crawford was, at the time of Sumner's visit, pursuing his art in poverty and obscurity. He was sorely in need of just such an appreciative friend as Sumner speedily proved himself to be. Indeed, it was mainly due to his ardent representations to friends at home that the genius of Crawford was brought to the notice of America and the world almost immediately after this visit to Rome. In his behalf Sumner promptly enlisted the interest of his fellow members of the 5 of clubs, together with that of Everett, Prescott, and Ticknor. To Hillard he wrote, "Crawford is now modelling an Orpheus descending into hell. The figure is as large as life. He is just charmed with his lyre, the 3-headed dog, and with an elastic step is starting on the facile descent. Cerberus is nodding at his feet. The idea is capital for sculpture, and thus far our countryman has managed it worthily. It is without exception the finest study I have seen in Rome, and if completed in corresponding style, and I do not doubt that he will do this, will be one of the most remarkable productions that has come from an artist of his years in modern times." Crawford is poor, and is obliged to live sparingly in order to continue his studies. If his soul were not in them, I think he would have abandoned them long ago. Strange to say, his best orders come from foreigners, English and Russians. Let him once have a good order from some gentleman of established character, and let the work be exhibited in America, and his way will be clear. Orders will then come upon him as fast as he can attend to them. It was the case with Greenough. Cooper saw him, was pleased with him, and gave him an order for his bust. This he executed finely. Cooper then ordered a group, which was the chanting cherubs, and gave Greenough the privilege of exhibiting it in the principal cities. From that moment his success was complete. Before he had been living as he could, not long after he was able to keep his carriage. In the matter of this letter I feel a sincere interest, because the artist is young, amiable, and poor, and benefiting him you will be sowing the seed which will ripen to the honor of our country. This amor patriae of the young scholar, whom President Quincy was afraid that Europe would spoil, crops out with no little prominence when he compares Greenough with his European contemporaries. From Florence he writes, Green at Rome. Greenough I like infinitely. He is a person of remarkable character every way, with scholarship such as few of our countrymen have, with a practical knowledge of his art and the poetry of it, with an elevated tone of mind that shows itself in his views of art and in all his conversation. I'm firmly convinced that he is a superior person to any of the great artists now on the stage. I've seen something, you know, of Chantrey in England, David in France, and those English fellows at Rome. As men, as specimens of the human race to be looked up to and imitated, they are not to be mentioned in the same breath with our countrymen. 3 cheers for the stripes and stars. Of the future author of the Greek slave, Sumner writes, I've seen a good deal of Powers. He is very pleasant and agreeable. His busts are truly remarkable, close likenesses without coarseness and vulgarity. I asked Greenough if he thought Powers could make a young Augustus, if he had a young Augustus to sit to him, was the reply. Sheriff Sumner passed away while his son was abroad. The mournful tidings reached Charles in Italy and cast a gloom over his otherwise delightful visit. There was no reason why this event should hasten his return home, and his family so advised him. The sheriff had left his widow and children in easy circumstances, with little to do besides the purely formal proceedings connected with the administration of his estate. Nevertheless, Sumner was keenly solicitous about the welfare of his younger brothers and sisters. The nature of this solicitude he reveals to Hillard. It is of the education of my younger brothers and sisters that I most think, he wrote, and I wish I were at home to aid them in their studies, to stimulate them, and to teach them to be ambitious. I've written to my mother at length on this subject, for I know no one on whom the responsibility of their education now depends more than myself. I have no right to trouble you on this subject, but I cannot forbear saying that you would render me a very great service if you would advise with my mother about this. I wish that the 3 younger children should have a competent French instructor to give them lessons in speaking and reading this language. I am anxious that my sisters should have the best education the country will afford. This I know their portion of our father's estate will amply give them. And further to that purpose, most freely do I devote whatever present or future interest I may have in it. This may be counted upon, that in any division of my father's property as regards my sisters, I am to be considered entirely out of the question, so that, if need be, reference may be had to this circumstance in incurring the necessary expenditure for their education. This I communicate to your private ear, not to be spoken of, but to be used for your government in any conversation you may have with my mother. It was ever thus with the young scholar. Dutiful son he was always, and generous and devoted brother. From Italy, Sumner passed into Germany, where he spent 5 interesting months in the study of the German language, laws, literature, and society, and where he met and conversed with the most celebrated people at Vienna, Berlin, Munich, Leipzig, Heidelberg, and other cities such as Brentz, Metternich, Humboldt, Rank, Thibaut, Savigny, Rome, and Bittermeier. From Berlin he writes, Hillard, I fain would rest here all the winter, pursuing my studies and mingling in this learned and gay world. I know everybody, and am engaged every day. All the distinguished professors I have seen familiarly, or received them at my own room. Romer and Rank, the historians of these 2, Rank pleases me the most. He has the most vivacity, humour, and, I should think, genius, and is placed before Romer here. Humboldt is very kind to me. He is placed at the head of the conversers of Germany. Savigny I know well, and have had the great pleasure of discussing with him the question of codification. He is placed by common consent at the head of jurisprudence in Germany, and you may say upon the whole continent. From Heidelberg he writes, Judge Story, I am here in this beautiful place to study German before I take my final leap to America. Lovely it is, even in this season, winter, with its hills in russet clad, but lovely indeed must it be when they are invested with the green and purple of summer and autumn. I have long talks with Mittermeier, who is a truly learned man, and like yourself works too hard. We generally speak French, though sometimes I attempt German and he attempts English, but we are both happy to return to the universal language of the European world. I like Thibaut very much. He is now aged but cheerful. His conversation is very interesting and abounds with scholarship. If he were not so modest, I should think him pedantic. In every other sentence he quotes a phrase from the Pandects or a classic. It has been a great treat to me to talk familiarly, as I have, with the two distinguished heads of the great schools, pro and con, on the subject of codification, Savigny and Thibaut. I've heard their views from their own lips and have had the honor of receiving them in my own room. After an absence of 12 months on the continent, Sumner returned to England, where he was the recipient of renewed attentions from the leaders in the British world of letters, politics, and law during the few weeks which remained to him before he sailed for America. James A. Wortley wrote him on the eve of his departure, You have had better opportunities of seeing all classes of society and all that is interesting among us than any other of your countrymen, and I trust that your experience may not disincline you to revisit us. Mrs. Basil Montague wrote, We shall long and kindly remember you. You have made an impression on this country equally honorable to England and to you. We have convinced you that we know how to value truth and dignified simplicity, and you have taught us to think much more highly of your country, from which we have hitherto seen no such men. Lady Carlisle and Robert Ingham actually shed tears when the young scholar took leave of them. Sumner landed in New York May 3, 1840. He was then 29 years old and had been abroad 29 months. The long period of preparation was ended, and the long period of labor begun. Hercules has at last emerged from the Nemean forest with his club. End of chapter 3.